Hello, this is Marcus Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about what you can do to protect yourself from the coronavirus. And I'm not really talking about the standard measures. We already know about that, the hand washing, the self-isolation, basic social distancing, all of that stuff. I'm not really going to cover that. There's about 1,000,001 other videos on the internet covering that at the moment. What I'm going to be talking about is what you can do with herbal medicine, with medicinal plants that may reduce your likelihood of developing a serious form of coronavirus if you catch it, and may possibly reduce your likelihood of catching it in the first place if you are exposed to it. So the caveat, it's not a disclaimer, but a caveat at least would be that there is no clinical research on the use of herbal medicine in coronavirus, COVID or SARS-2 yet, because it's kind of early days for this pandemic, obviously. So what we do have, however, is a lot of laboratory data on pharmaceutical constituents of various plants. We also have a lot of plants that were traditionally used to reduce the likelihood of catching respiratory tract infections. And we do in some cases have animal or even human clinical data showing that some of those plants are effective against viruses of the same type as COVID-2 or COVID-19 or whatever they're calling it now, SARS 2.0. So what I'm going to do is tell you about all of those plants, how they can be used, how I as a medical herbalist would suggest that you use them, and I will show my working throughout. All of the references and papers that I talk about will be linked in the description box below the video on YouTube. And I will also try to describe for each plant that I mention any contraindications. That's to say, any reasons why you shouldn't use it. But I'll say it before we get into the plants. I just want to say that if you have any pre-existing medical conditions, if you already have a chronic condition, or if you're taking any prescription medication, please do remember that medicinal plants are they're active pharmaceuticals. They're pharmaceutically active. They are drugs. The root of the word drug is an old Anglo-Saxon word, drigan, meaning dried, as in dried plant. So just because it's natural doesn't mean it's necessarily safe. Now, I'm a medical herbalist. I think medicinal plants are amazing. They can do really amazing things because of all the different compounds a single plant can contain and does contain. But it does mean you have to use your common sense. If you're on any prescription medication, please do check with your doctor and or preferably both, your pharmacist as well, because pharmacists often have databases of medicinal herbs that they can check with. And I've included in the links on YouTube below this video a simple herb drug interaction checker online run by the website WebMD. It doesn't include every herb on there. There may be several of the herbs that I mentioned in this video that are not on that database simply because we don't have the information for them. But what I'm saying is please check before you take any medicines, any plants recommended in this video, and use a bit of common sense. Okay, so to begin with, I've got my notes here as usual. I was just going to cover a few basics about coronavirus and then get into the plants. So coronaviruses are a large family of viruses. They're called zoonotic, meaning they come from animals, like zoo animals, and they most commonly cause respiratory tract symptoms. That's, either upper respiratory tract, so that's like sinuses and face and throat, or lower respiratory tract, that's lungs. COVID-19 or SARS-2 as it's being called now mainly affects the lungs, causing pneumonia, respiratory distress, sometimes cause other organs to struggle like the liver or kidneys, and can sometimes cause other symptoms like diarrhea, I think we're all aware of the common symptoms it causes, such as a dry cough, fever, headache, fatigue, muscle aches and pains, and occasionally diarrhea and other symptoms too. The features of the virus is that it is, and this is important, this is going to be very important, it's an enveloped virus. That means it basically has a little skin of protein. So a lot of viruses are envelope viruses. That is, as I say, important. It's a single strand RNA virus. That's not terribly important for my purposes today. In terms of some stats, in terms of the people it's most likely to affect severely, as we know, it's very age linked. The older you are, the more likely you are to get a severe case. Although, again, just because you're young doesn't mean that you couldn't get severe effects from being infected by SARS-2, and just because you're old doesn't mean that you will get a severe case. It's just more likely. So for anyone who's over 80, 14 to 22% of the people who caught coronavirus, this latest coronavirus, died. 14 to 22% of those confirmed cases died, whereas for those between 40 and 50, it was about 0.4%, and for those under 40 it was 0.2. So there's a pretty steep rise in death the older you get when people get COVID. There are also men are more severely affected than women. The death rate in men overall was, I think, 2.8% versus women was 1.7%. These stats are all linked below the video. These stats are now about a month old because I started researching this video a month ago, and of course, this being a pandemic, that it's being updated all the time. And conditions which are comorbid with it, in other words, which increase the likelihood of having a severe case, the worst ones are actually all circulatory, cardiovascular. So heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, in other words. Those are the conditions which are most likely to be associated with more severe cases. And again, that will become relevant in a moment. So, in terms of prevention, well, apart from the obvious, the social isolation and the hand wash, social distancing and all of that, hand washing, not contacting people you don't need to, not going out more often than you absolutely need to, that kind of thing, there's really not a lot that can be done. Yes, it absolutely is a good idea to maximise your immunity, to get enough sleep, to eat good food, to carry on doing a bit of exercise, even though we're all mostly housebound and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely, because it means if you do get it, you'll have a better chance of getting rid of it faster and of having a more robust immune response. But doing all that stuff doesn't necessarily protect you from getting it in the first place, because this is a novel virus. It's something, the way that the immune system works is it produces antibodies, it produces proteins that recognize invading organisms, not just antibodies, but anyway, just generally proteins. Simple version, it produces proteins that recognize invading organisms, and these proteins are genetically coded for. If it's something that our immune system hasn't come across before, then unless you happen to have won the genetic lottery and your immune system has spontaneously produced the antibody to this new COVID, which in some cases that may be so. So a few people will probably have naturally already existing immunity to it. The vast majority of people will not recognize this invader as an invader until it's already in their system and doing its thing, at which point they get sick. And of course, the illness is the symptoms of the illness are caused by your body's reaction to it being there. Illness is generally, the symptoms we get are designed to immobilize us so that our body can shuts down all unnecessary activity. That's why you get a headache and muscle aches and all the rest of it, 'cause it's like, sit down, shut up, and let me get rid of this virus. So the point is, whatever substance you take, if your immune system doesn't have the necessary it doesn't have the ability to recognize the invader, then you can still get it. However, if you are in a stronger physical condition, if your immune system is functioning better, etc., if you're well rested, if you've got all the right vitamins and blah, 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 then yes, you're more likely to shake it off, hypothetically. But it's not always linear, particularly with something that is novel and highly virulent, in other words, that spreads quite easily. Okay, so that's the first thing to get out of the way. But what you can do is take plants which weaken the virus, or both, hopefully, strengthen your immune response to it, and or strengthen your immune response to it. So there are a couple of plants I really wanted to bring up here. And the first, you'll have probably seen this on Facebook or other places. It seems to be quite popular at the moment. I know a lot of people have sold out, a lot of people who manufacture this product, and that's elderberry, Sambucus nigra. It was traditionally used, elderberries particularly, were particularly used to reduce viral infections, the symptoms, the duration, particularly colds and flu. But there's a quote from, I think, Salmon's Herbal, 1700s, saying elderberries were used as I love this quote, as a catholicum against all illnesses. I don't know what the word catholicum means, but I just like it. It sounds good. So what sort of science is there behind that? I mean, we know that traditionally elderberry rob, which is a syrup made by boiling the berries down or pressing the juice out of the berries and boiling that down, maybe with a bit of sugar, that was used in colds and flus. It's a gypsy remedy, it's a Romany remedy, it's a very traditional European plant. All parts of the elderberry were used for various different conditions in European herbal medicine. It's a very useful tree. There are several studies which I'll link below on YouTube. Firstly, there was a meta-analysis of, I think, 17 different studies. A meta-analysis is a really useful thing where they collate the results of all previous clinical trials on one substance and then filter out those which don't come up to code, which aren't a high enough standard to merit inclusion. So it's actually quite a useful thing. It's like a literature review with sort of grading standards where they exclude anything that is not good enough. And a meta-analysis from 2019 on elderberry found that supplementation with elderberry substantially reduced upper respiratory symptoms with a large effect size. So that was, I think, looking at elderberry in upper respiratory tract infections in general. Now, SARS-2 or COVID, the worry is that produces lower respiratory tract symptoms, but that at least shows that elderberry in general was useful for upper respiratory tract symptoms. There's also an anti-influenza effect in the laboratory of elderberry juice that was demonstrated in 2012, where they found that concentrated elderberry juice retarded the replication of flu viruses, but a much stronger effect in live mice, where the elderberry juice, concentrated elderberry juice, inhibited viral replication in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid in the lungs. What that means in English is that by giving the live mice, elderberry juice, the replication of the flu virus in the lungs was inhibited. Now, obviously, this is influenza virus, not a coronavirus. The common denominator with those two types of viruses is that they're both enveloped viruses, which I referred to earlier in this video. In other words, they have a viral coat, and that becomes relevant, as you'll see. It also, and this is relevant, significantly increased antibody responses to the virus in the bronchiolar lavage fluid. That means in the lungs, in the fluid in the lungs, the immune response to the virus was increased by the elderberry juice, and there was a dose-dependent reduction in the virus yield in the lungs of the mice given the elderberry juice. So it reduced the amount of virus found in the lungs. In a human, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trial. That means where it was tested in humans against a placebo, very high standard of trial. In a small amount of people, not a large trial, but still high quality. In 2016, elderberry extract was tested for its effects on colds and the symptoms of colds in air travellers. And the people given real elderberry were found to have a reduction in upper respiratory tract symptoms, a reduction in the cold duration, but no difference in the incidence. In other words, the elderberry didn't stop them getting colds, but did mean that the colds that they got were weaker. Now, colds, again, they're not coronaviruses, they're rhinoviruses, but again, envelope viruses. I think. I need to check that, but I think they are. In vitro, elderberry syrup was able to inhibit several strains of flu virus. Now, okay, this is all flu. What about coronaviruses? Because that's what we're worried about. Well, there was antiviral activity of elderberry and other plants against more than one type of virus from animals. That included HIV, herpes simplex, or the cold sore or genital herpes virus, flu viruses, hepatitis and Coxsackie viruses. I couldn't get hold of that whole paper because they were charging an exorbitant amount of money to see the whole thing. I only saw the abstract, but from the abstract it's clear that elderberry extract, I'm not sure whether that was the berries or the flowers or the leaves or the bark, had activity. But far more relevant, or at least potentially more relevant, we've got Sambucus nigra, that's elderberry, the European elderberry, was found to inhibit infectious bronchitis virus in chickens. Now, infectious bronchitis virus is basically chicken SARS. It's a coronavirus that infects chickens, and it inhibited the growth and replication of that virus in vitro in the laboratory without cell toxicity, without damaging any animal cells, and in a dose-responsive manner. In other words, the higher the amount of elderberry applied, the more virus died without killing the animal cells the virus was replicating in. And it did so by compromising the viral envelope, by damaging the envelope of the coronavirus, and in the same way that it does to influenza viruses. Again, all of these studies are linked in the description box below YouTube. What they found in this study with the IBV, with the infectious bronchitis virus, which is chicken SARS, is a coronavirus, but in chickens, that pre-treatment with elderberry was necessary, but not sufficient for complete virus inhibition. And they also found that elderberry, Sambucus nigra, can inhibit infectious bronchitis virus at an early part of the infection by rendering the virus non-infectious. So what that means is you would, if this has relevance to humans, and I think there is a good reason to suppose that it might, because elderberry was used traditionally to reduce the likelihood of getting viral infections. It was used traditionally as I say, Catholicum against all illnesses, and I think that means particularly viral illnesses, respiratory viral illnesses. It is found in the laboratory to inhibit many different types of virus, and does so by inhibiting the viral envelope of enveloped viruses. Coronavirus is an envelope virus. It increases the immune response to viruses in lung fluid. I mean, that was a trial in animals, in mice, with the lung fluid, but again in humans we saw that it was useful against flu viruses and upper respiratory tract infections in general, in reducing their duration and severity. And we know from the chicken thing with the coronavirus in chickens that it directly affects, weakens coronavirus, the infectious bronchitis virus in chickens. And a related species, Sambucus formosa nakai, which is a Japanese species of elderberry, was found to have strong in vitro antiviral activity against the human coronavirus NL63. That's not this one. This was a paper from a couple of years ago, I think. It's just that they happen to have tested it. It doesn't mean that this Japanese species is the one that you need. It means that they used the Japanese species. Presumably these were Japanese researchers, so they were using their local species. I think there's a pretty good there's good reason to suppose that it might be useful. Now, the only small caveat with elderberry is because you can buy lots of different elderberry preparations. You can buy whole elderberries. The way that you'd take it is you'd either eat about, say, half a teaspoon of dried elderberry twice a day. You could take an elderberry syrup. There are lots of preparations on the market. Elderberry juice, again, lots of preparations on the market. A couple of caveats. Number one, elderberries in their raw state contain cyanogenic compounds. That means compounds that break down to form cyanide. So you don't want to be ingesting large amounts of raw elderberry unless you particularly want to be throwing up and have diarrhea for several days. So I would suggest just keeping the dose. So if you just have dried elderberries, just eat half a teaspoon or something twice a day. That's entirely adequate to get a baseline level of antiviral compounds into your system. The second thing to say is that there's been this internet meme doing the rounds. I'll see if I can find it and stick it on the screen, suggesting that elderberry causes a cytokine storm because it increases the immune response to viruses, and the damage in the lungs caused by COVID, by SARS-2 in those people who get the bad version, the strong version, SARS-2 max, that lung damage is caused by a very strong sort of almost hyper-inflammatory response by the immune system in the lungs. Okay, that's true, but whoever has produced that meme has taken 1 plus 1 and made 11 out of it. So yes, we know that taking elderberry increases the immune response to viruses, but elderberry is also anti-inflammatory. I found the original blog, which seems to be the source of this rumour, and it's written by seems to be a fairly competent herbalist, I think in America, calling herself Stephanie, and she suggests that elderberry in the laboratory upregulates the cytokines, that's chemical messengers, IL-6, IL-8 and tumour necrosis factor, and by upregulating those it will upregulate the cytokines that increase inflammation and therefore could cause a cytokine storm. Well, okay, I think her logic is interesting, but there is absolutely no evidence from history, from the years that elderberry has been used in clinical practice, that it would do that. And in fact, the actual use in viral infections that we've seen and in the clinical trials shows that even though it increases the immune response to the virus, it also seems to exert at the same time an anti-inflammatory effect and reduce the level of virus in the system. So there's no evidence that in practice it actually induces a cytokine storm. This is a very hypothetical conclusion produced by pulling one thread out of a very complex carpet. So I would suggest that elderberry is absolutely fine to take, but I would suggest that elderberry be taken before you get sick, just supplement with it, or at the very beginning of the sickness and during. And if you get any symptoms, then you add other herbs, you take other substances to reduce the inflammation in the lungs. Elderberry on its own, from all the research that I've read, I would think would reduce the viral load, the amount of virus in the system. That would be how I would think it would work. Again, we don't know, we have no clinical data at this point, but there are certainly no reports of cytokine storm in the past as a result of using elderberry, and I see absolutely no reason or no evidence to support that hypothesis. It just seems to me the most blatant form of herb scaremongering, even though it may well have come from a legitimate hypothesis, because it looks like this person who wrote this article, this Stephanie, appears to be a competent herbalist. The thread of her article, the thrust of her article wasn't that elderberry was rubbish, just that there were other alternatives, which there are, but in terms of the evidence base for this coronavirus, I think elderberry has the strongest, because there isn't much, but that has, elderberry at least has some. So that's number one, I would recommend. Number two, a bit left field, weaker evidence base than elderberry, but that would be mulberry, and particularly mulberry fruit. Apparently, people were using mulberry fruit when SARS hit China for the first time 20 years ago or whatever. So that's interesting. Excuse me, people are ringing me and all sorts. I'm filming on my phone. The traditional use of mulberry fruits in Chinese medicine was as they were used for anti-aging sort of remedies for joint, liver and kidney problems, for improving eyesight, and were classified as tonifying the blood and enriching the yin. That means enriching the yin is like reducing constipation and helping slow down aging, sort of this idea that the body will dry up as you get older, and mulberry will help to prevent that. Whether or not that's true, we do know that in the laboratory, mulberry contains antiviral compounds which work against influenza viruses, and also contains a substance called deoxynorgyrimycin, just reading that one here, which works in the laboratory against hepatitis B and C viruses. It also seems to have enhance the activity of some white blood cells called macrophages, which are part of the primary defense system in the laboratory again, and contains some substances called polysaccharides, which are multiple long sugar chains, and pyrrole alkaloids, which enhance immune responses. There's also one trial showing the effect of giving piglets supplementing the diet of piglets with these polysaccharides taken from mulberry leaves, not the fruit but the leaves, but the polysaccharides I believe are found in the fruits as well, and it found that in those piglets it improved their potential immune response to viral infections by pushing up their production of interferon, interleukin 1, 2 and 8, which are all cytokines, these little chemical messengers of the immune system, which would enhance responsiveness to viral infections. What else have we got? Now, that's all sort of like pretty weak evidence, but we know that from the laboratory at least that mulberry contains compounds which have antiviral activity against some types of envelope virus, and we know that from the live pig experiment that the polysaccharides in it actually do modify the immune response. And then what we've also got, this is relevant given the risk factors of getting more severe coronavirus, that mulberry is actually somewhat anti-diabetic. We know that diabetes is a risk factor for getting a more severe form of SARS from coronavirus, of the severe acute respiratory syndrome. So mulberries enhanced, I think in a human trial, they decreased fasting blood glucose, glycosylated serum proteins in diabetic mice. So this is a trial in mice, but it reduced the blood sugar and decreased the amount of sugars found stuck to proteins in the blood. In other words, it reduced sort of diabetic indicators. And over several weeks, the administration of extracts of the fruit were able to normalize blood glucose levels in diabetic rats. And similarly, hypertensive rats, rats with high blood pressure, fed mulberry as part of their diet over 6 weeks, showed a decrease, a drop in blood pressure in a dose-dependent manner. In other words, the more mulberry they were given to eat, the lower their blood pressure fell. And that was achieved not by dilating the blood vessels or by making them pee more or by slowing the heart down or any of those conventional mechanisms of blood pressure lowering drugs, but by actually reducing or partly reversing atherosclerosis, which is the process of furring up of the arteries, as well as reducing blood vessel hyperreactivity. So it slightly did relax the blood vessels, prevented them from spasming and pushing up the blood pressure, but also partially reversed and inhibited the process of atherosclerosis, furring up the arteries in these rats. So there is some anti-diabetic and anti-inflammatory activity in mulberry fruits, which might be a useful background to it. What else have we got? In obese animals, feeding them mulberry was found to reduce inflammation and accelerate wound healing, and also protected their liver from chemical damage to some extent. So mulberry much weaker evidence base than for elderberry, but I would suggest it tastes nice. It's got some antiviral compounds in it. As a supplement, I'm just taking a combination of elderberry and mulberry at the moment, with 2 parts mulberry, 1 part elderberry, just twice a day. Tastes nice, just a little handful of that mixture to get some antiviral compounds into my system. Why the hell not? At the worst, I'm just increasing my intake of antioxidants, which, you know, and some fruit, some dried fruit. That is the worst. If I were to eat massive amounts of elderberry, I might give myself cyanide poisoning, so I'm not going to do that. Okay. What else to say? So that's all about sort of pre-treatment, not really prevention, but pre-treatment. Those are the 2 plants that I would recommend. There are, of course, probably thousands more plants that might be useful, but these are 2 that I was able to pull out the research, and with particularly with elderberry, with some fairly robust evidence. Less so for mulberry, but I think it would be useful. Okay. The second part of this video is going to be about strategies if you do get coronavirus. What can you take or use that might prevent you from ending up in hospital and taking up a bed and a respirator, or whatever. And so I'm going to focus on herbs which might be symptom reducing, which might be antiviral, which might stimulate the immune response, and which will reduce inflammation, because like I say, a lot of the severe problems that people are getting with corona are because of the excessive inflammation that their immune system triggers. So the first herb I'm going to mention is Echinacea, or the purple coneflower, which a small clinical trial in 473 participants, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled gold standard clinical trial, found that a combination of elderberry and Echinacea was of comparable efficacy to the antiviral drug oseltamivir in influenza. Now, oseltamivir only works in flu, but that's very interesting because both of these plants, elderberry and Echinacea, are non-specific. Elderberry is, I would say, more strongly virally inhibiting. Echinacea, although it contains some virally inhibiting substances, more strongly modifies the immune response. So you put those 2 together and you've got this combination which increases the immune response and sort of hamstrings the virus at the same time. So that was very interesting. Yes, it was a trial in flu, not in coronavirus, but if we read between the lines, I think that's very potentially suggestive. And there was also a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials with over 2,458 participants, finding that taking Echinacea root extract potently lowered the risk of recurrent respiratory infections and complications, including pneumonia, within the strong, and that effect was strongest in susceptible individuals. And the key take home from this trial was that the ethanolic extract, i.e. the tincture, was stronger than juices or pills or dried products. So there are certain Echinacea tinctures I would recommend in terms of what you can buy over the counter. The one made, I think, called Echinaforce by Vice is decent. The dose given on the bottle is way too small. You want to take about a teaspoon, if you have an acute infection, a teaspoon every 3 or 4 hours for an adult would be about right. With Echinacea, again, because it stimulates the immune response, if you get a cough with coronavirus, you'd want to take something to reduce inflammation in the lungs. So that's what I'm coming on to next. If you just use the Echinacea, there is that theoretical risk of increasing the immune response too much. So you don't want to speed up your body's clearance of the virus at the expense of making the inflammation in the lungs worse. So I'm just going to give you 3 herbs, 4 herbs, in fact, which might be useful in the cough and lung symptoms associated with coronavirus. Herb number 1, Elecampane, otherwise Inula helenium is its Latin name. It was traditionally used for infectious lung problems such as tuberculosis. According to the 16th 17th century apothecary Nicholas Culpeper. It was useful for cough, shortness of breath and wheezing, for such as cannot breathe unless they hold their necks upright. So in other words, people have real difficulty breathing. It was traditionally very warming and helped to loosen phlegm in the lungs, and was used against phlegmy coughs and resisted poison. And not much scientific evidence for this, a bit of pharmacology but not much trial of it. But in the lab, Elecampane extracts reduced inflammation and inflammatory cytokine production in respiratory epithelium. In other words, they reduced the production of inflammatory substances in lung tissue in the laboratory, and the constituent allantoglactone was found principally responsible for that. Contraindications for Echinacea and Elecampane. The main one would be allergy. The second one would be you don't want to be using Echinacea, the previous herb, if you have an autoimmune condition, because it stimulates the immune system. So any autoimmune condition, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, whatever, you want to be a bit careful of it. I know there are herbalists who do use Echinacea in autoimmune conditions. I would just err on the side of caution there. Controversial, but I would err on the side of caution and not use it if you have an autoimmune condition. But Elecampane, if you're allergic to plants in the daisy family, because it's a member of that family, it does contain sesquiterpene lactones. In fact, those are its active ingredients, and for some people they can be allergic to sesquiterpene lactones, but it's a very useful herb, particularly for symptomatically easing coughing and lung inflammation. The second cough herb I want to bring up, the second herb, is one called white Horehound, Marrubium vulgare, and this I think would be my top herb for potential COVID complications. And this is why. Traditionally it was used for coughs and consumption, like Elecampane was, for tough phlegm on the chest, for those who are short-winded, love this phrase, to void cold rooms from the lungs of old folks. In other words, to help ease breathing, particularly people who feel cold and feel like there's cold in their lungs and they can't breathe easily. The reason I really like this one is because the pharmacology of it, I've put a paper in the links below. It's strongly anti-inflammatory, and we know that because it reduces the synthesis of these little substances called prostaglandins, which increase inflammation. And it had significantly anti-inflammatory effects in rat pleural leukocytes. That's the white blood cells in the lungs of rats. And we know in humans with SARS, it's the white blood cells in the lungs that stimulate too much inflammation. It also decreased peripheral neutrophils. That's the level of white blood cells in the peripheral immune system, and the production of tumor necrosis factor alpha, this inflammatory cytokine. So this plant potentially would be very good for reducing excessive inflammatory response in the lungs of people who had SARS-2, and therefore could be combined quite nicely with something like Echinacea and Elderberry to provide symptomatic relief and reduce inflammation in the lungs. It was also found to be anti-edematous, that means reduced swelling and microvascular leakage in the lung tissue of mice. It was antispasmodic, in other words, would help to reduce cough-type spasms in smooth muscle in the laboratory. And it also helped to lower blood pressure, as demonstrated in rats, and was anti-diabetic in diabetic rats. So this plant not only should reduce inflammation in the lungs, make breathing a bit easier, but also potentially might help to lower blood pressure and improve blood sugar control, two risk factors for more severe reactions to this virus. It also has a bit of an anti-arrhythmic effect, at least according to some authors, so to help heart arrhythmias. Contraindications for Marrubium, for white horehound, it's very bitter, so it can stimulate digestive secretion. So if you have GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, if you're getting a lot of heartburn, it could aggravate that. If you're diabetic, you want to be careful because taking it will lower your blood sugar more, so you might need to adjust your dose of insulin, maybe reduce it a bit, see how you go, just monitor your blood sugar more carefully. And again, because it's a plant, there could be allergies to it, so just be aware of those possibilities. The third herb I want to mention, I think we're on third. In terms of lungs, very important plant, licorice, Glycyrrhiza glabra. Again, traditional use for coughs, upper respiratory tract, or even urinary tract irritation, as a gentle laxative. In traditional Chinese medicine, it was used as a qi tonic, meaning it improves the life energy. Now, what I think this translates to physically is that licorice retards the breakdown of cortisol, that stress steroid. The active ingredients, glycyrrhizin and other related compounds in it, are steroidal glycosides. They're shaped like steroids, such as cortisol, natural steroids that the body produces, and it prolongs the amount of time cortisol hangs around in the system. So that means it reduces inflammation and it takes the weight off the adrenals a bit. The adrenals have to produce less cortisol. The adrenals sort of get more bang for their buck. But this also can lead to long-term side effects from licorice. Out of all the herbs I've talked about, ironically, licorice, the one which most people would think of as probably the most harmless because you eat it sweet flavoured with it, well, some people do, some people hate it, I love it, but they would think that licorice would be the most harmless. In fact, it's the one with the most side effects potentially, because as you take it over a long period of time, because it's prolonging the half-life of cortisol, it can have a knock-on effect which causes retention of sodium and water. So that can push up the blood pressure and knock the sodium potassium levels in your body, the electrolyte levels, out of balance. So that can be problematic for people with heart arrhythmias, with high blood pressure, with fluid retention, with kidney diseases. So licorice is something that can be used for the short term or even for the medium term by healthy people. But if you have high blood pressure, kidney disease, irregular heartbeat, or taking medications like steroids, please do check with your doctor. If you're taking any medication, check that you're okay to use licorice. The reason I'm recommending licorice is because it's amazing for reducing coughs. It has an anti-inflammatory effect in the lungs. It helps to loosen mucus, but also glycyrrhizin, one of the main active compounds in licorice, was found to be the most effective compound tested against the SARS coronavirus, the one that in the early 2000s, because they went and tested a bunch of compounds from plants, and it was the most effective inhibitory compound. So it actually really inhibits the replication of coronavirus. So if you included licorice in a formula, not only would it help to relieve a cough and reduce inflammation in the lungs, but it would also actually contribute to inhibiting the virus. So potentially a good combination, if you had the corona cough and you'd already got it, would be something like elderberry, echinacea, white horehound and licorice as a combination. And the way that you'd use licorice is you buy the dried root and you boil it, you simmer it. White horehound you get as a dried herb and then just infuse it, you add it. You can find, there are doses to all of these herbs available on the internet, but broadly speaking, for something like Echinacea root, I would recommend an alcohol-based tincture, about a teaspoon every 4 or 5 hours in an acute situation. For something like elderberry, like I say, half a teaspoon of dried berry twice a day, or if you buy the syrup, there'll be directions on the packet. For something like white horehound, it's very bitter, so about a teaspoon of the herb infused in a cup of boiling water, strained and drunk 3 times a day. Licorice root, use about a teaspoon of licorice, but you boil that for about 10, 15, 20 minutes in a cup of water. So you could boil your licorice root and then add your white horehound or whatever to it to steep afterwards, after you've brought it off the boil, and then drink that 2 or 3 times a day. As I said, for licorice, if you have high blood pressure, water retention, heart failure, high potassium levels, heart arrhythmias, or are taking steroids or other medications, please do check with your doctor and your pharmacist before using it. And the last herb I wanted to mention in terms of coughs and corona, or even corona related diarrhea, just corona symptoms in general, would be the herb called MULLEIN, Verbascum thapsus. And this herb was traditionally used for coughs, for diarrhea and for consumption. Again, it's regarded as a demulcent, something which soothes mucous membranes. It will soothe the linings of your insides, and it will probably do that in the lungs, partly by reflex, because the lungs and the stomach share a common innervation by the vagus nerve, which controls sort of things like the cough reflex and the diaphragm's responses and stuff, and it's connected to both the stomach and the lungs, which is why when you take honey or glycerin or something like a cough syrup, it can soothe the cough, even though it's not going down your windpipe, it's going down your trachea, it's going into your stomach. I mean, if you inhale it and goes into your lungs, you're in trouble. That will make a cough worse, not better. So if you've ever wondered why syrups make coughs better, even though they're going down your throat and into your stomach, it's probably because the throat and the stomach share that common vagal innervation. So if you reduce the irritability of one, it will have a reflex effect on the other. So demulcent plants are plants which contain mucilages, constituents which reduce irritation in the linings of the stomach or digestive tract, for example, and therefore may also have a knock-on reflex effect in the lungs. But there's probably also some pharmacology going on there too. With the MULLEIN, we found that in vitro in the laboratory it was antiviral against influenza A with twice the potency of the influenza drug amantadine. It was antiviral again in the laboratory against this pseudo-rabies virus that affects pigs, which is also like coronavirus and like flu virus, an enveloped virus, and it was also antiviral in vitro against the herpes virus. I've mentioned all these viruses before. Of course, they're not coronaviruses, but like corona, they are enveloped viruses. Now, this is a weak level of evidence. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be useful, but from its traditional use, we know that MULLEIN was very indicated for chronic lingering coughs and debility in the respiratory system. So MULLEIN could be used drunk as a tea, as a warm tea, for anyone particularly in the recovery phase from corona. And it would be useful not only, I think, for reducing lung irritation, but also potentially for reducing gastrointestinal irritation if anyone's had corona diarrhea or anything like that. So anyway, herbs I mentioned are going to be below the description box on YouTube. The last thing I wanted to say is that in China they've had great success, at least according to themselves and their publicity machine, with traditional Chinese medicine in corona. They've obviously used it alongside Western medicine, but those hospitals which have incorporated traditional Chinese herbal medicine alongside the Western medicine have had much better results, which for me as a herbalist is incredibly heartening and inspiring, because I think that's really what we need to be doing. We don't need to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We don't need to be ignoring thousands of years of use of these plants just because we now think we can do better. It's in times like this when we realise that there are and probably always will be holes in our knowledge, and that some of the things which we used to know might be able to at least patch some of those holes and be of use. Anyway, I hope this was good. If you enjoyed this content, if you found it useful, please do like, subscribe, share this video, share it with anyone who you think might find it useful. In my next video, I'll be going esoteric and I'll be talking about the medieval astrology of coronavirus, putting my other hat as a medieval astrologer, as a traditional astrologer on. So some of you won't be into that, some of you will love it. If you like the sound of that, then please be there for that. I'll be putting that up in a couple of weeks. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you very much and bye.